Woody says sometimes, you know, when you watch people at sporting events, it's almost like, not almost like, it is like watching people worship. So that just made me think of that today. So what we're going to talk about tonight is, what does it look like to worship God? Not a local sports team or professional sports team. What's it look like to worship God? It's what we talked about yesterday in church. And for me, well, I just went way off track there. But for me, what happened when I was growing up, I got a lot of misconceptions about what does it look like to worship God. That didn't always happen from people who weren't Christ followers. Oftentimes it happened from the church itself or people that often call themselves Christ followers. A couple of the misconceptions that I got, I just want to go over a few of those with you tonight. The first one was, one of the first memories I actually have of church growing up was sitting next to a real good friend of mine. His name was Jeff Keister. I can still remember that. But we used to have this game that we used to play. It was actually kind of a battleship game, right? Where we would fold up pieces of paper and we would draw battleships on it. And it was actually this way where we could draw dots on it and sink each other's battleships. And we had this real covert way that we would pass it back and forth to each other through hymnals, right? In the Methodist church growing up. Real covert, real smart. But the kind of inappropriate lesson I learned from that was that somehow worship is about my own gratification, right? Worship for me is about me being entertained. And I don't think completely that has changed for some of us, and probably even for me on certain levels in some way to this day. I can remember when I first came to Blue Ridge, I wasn't really looking for a place where I could connect to God. I remember sitting there the first time thinking, you know, I think I could actually sit through a sermon here and not get bored. Or I can remember thinking, I like the band, I like the kids community. I don't even have kids, but I like the kids community. So it was about me, it was about my gratification, about what I could get out of it. Another thing I can remember growing up that was kind of a screwed up misconception about worship was, I can remember my parents making me get up, get dressed up, and go to church. And I didn't want to, right? So for me, worship was kind of a guilt thing, right? And sometimes, still to this day, I show up for reasons other than to worship God. Sometimes I show up just because I know Woody and Stephen are going to be there. And maybe I'm going to have to answer if I don't show up, right? So what about you guys? Do you ever show up to an environment not because you're there to worship God or you're there to acknowledge God and what He's done for you, but you're just there because, you know, you might have to answer to somebody? Has that ever happened to you guys at all? Another one for me, another screwed up misconception about worship was fishing for blessings. Did you guys ever do that growing up? Where you go to church? Like for me, the best way I can explain this, I went through a spell growing up where I really didn't show up to church, you know, with the attitude of coming to worship until one day I had a scare where I thought my girlfriend was pregnant, right? And then all of a sudden, buddy, I was there. I was praying every Sunday, right? I was into the sermons. I never raised my hands in church, but it was a Methodist church. Nobody raised their hands in church there. But I was there. I was showing up, and I was all in. But I was fishing for blessings, right? Showing up not just to give love. It was love, but it was a conditional love. I was there for God, but it had conditions associated with it. So, and sometimes I think we still do that. Sometimes I think we show up fishing for blessings. If I do this, maybe God's going to bless me. If I show up and I worship, maybe God's going to bless me. And finally, probably the biggest screw up, the biggest mess up so far as what is worship was, I kind of developed the idea that worship happened roughly on Sunday between the hours of 10 and 12:30 every week. That was when worship happened. And whenever you left the church, you never really talked about God. You never really sought God in your life. You never really looked for God. And sometimes I think that still happens to a certain degree to me now. The life that I live outside the church sometimes isn't necessarily, I'm not exactly the same person outside the church sometimes that I am inside the church. Sometimes, for example, when I'm alone, I might be a different person than when I am sitting here in front of all you guys tonight. So what about you guys? Is there ever a gap between the person that you are when you come to worship, when you're not in church? Is there a gap? Does worship not leave beyond Blue Ridge for you, right? So that's some of the baggage just that I brought in yesterday as we were going through this. But so we walked in and Woody gave us a definition of what worship is, and he made us repeat it a couple times. Does anybody remember what that is? We should make Woody answer it. Go ahead. Run, George.
The appropriate response to the revelation of God.
The appropriate response to the revelation of God. Let's everybody say that. The appropriate response to the revelation of God. Right. Now, we could spend the rest of the night just dissecting this. What is the appropriate response to the revelation of God? For example, if I was to look at you and say, HB, what is the revelation of God? What is the revelation of God? No, you don't have to answer it. But if I was to say it to any one of you guys in the room, what is the revelation of God? Now, that's an important question because that's what determines our response, right? Our response is directly determined by our revelation of who God is. For me, the answer to that question is the revelation of God is who I know God to be and what he has done for me. That, for me, is the revelation of God. But, like I said, that is important. For some of us, we might say, I believe in God, but I don't really know who God is. And that's going to affect the way that we worship him. Or maybe we have kind of a distorted view of who God is. Maybe God is somebody we kind of have to look over our shoulder because he might zap us with a lightning bolt if we don't do exactly what it is that we're supposed to do. And that's going to affect the way that you worship God. Maybe you would approach God more of a guilty fashion. But for those of us who are Christ followers in the room, what is the revelation of God? For you, what does the term grace mean? How does that affect your revelation of God? Or salvation? Or eternal salvation? Or spending eternity with God? The right to call God Father? The right to be an heir to the kingdom of God? These are all things that, when we really break it down, our revelation of God. And then how do we respond to that? What is the appropriate response to that, really? What is given what you know about God and what he has done for you, what is the appropriate response? Is it to show up on Sunday once a week and keep a chair warm at Blue Ridge? Is that the appropriate response? Depending on what your revelation of God is, that may be. Is it to show up to a group like this, for example, and say, me, 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 it's all about me. Feed me, feed me, feed me. Or is it to show up and say, who's here that I can help? Who's sitting at my table tonight that I can reach out to? Maybe call them this week and encourage them. Who's here at my table this week that I can pray for this week? What's your revelation of God? It's going to directly determine your response. And what's the appropriate response at your jobs? You know, what's the people that you come into contact with, or you know, the business interactions that you have? What's the appropriate response at your job? What about with your family, your parents and your siblings? Or if you're married, what's your appropriate response in your interactions day to day with your wife or your children? You know, we have a few mantras around here, one of which is 1, 2, 3, go. That's real original. I think Stephen probably came up with that one. 1, 2, 3, go, or leave the religious crap in the parking lot. But I think another mantra that we need to have around here is, what does the Bible have to say about that, right? So that's one I think we should start throwing out here a lot more often. What does the Bible have to say about that? And the verse that I want to talk about tonight, pretty short and straightforward. It's actually Romans 12. And Paul's writing to Christians in Rome, and it says, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him."